and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
There's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on podcastufo.com. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to our show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and we're broadcasting live from a mountaintop in Maine. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? And we have the one and only Alejandro Rojas coming on to spend the entire night, the 2 hours with us in just a minute. I want to thank you all for listening to the show, and I also want to thank the people that support the show. And if you can't support the show and you still would like to hear the entire show, you can listen live here every Wednesday at podcastufo.com. 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you can also go over to PSN Radio. We're live there as well. And that's PSN I think it's radio.com. I should know that. And there's a Skype chat room over there. There's a chat room on Podcast UFO, and you're welcome to jump in there and pose us some questions this evening. And don't forget, we also run the show as a full show as a podcast on the Dark Matter Digital Network every Thursday from 10 to midnight, and that's also Eastern Standard Time. And Alejandro, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I've heard so much about the show, and everybody writes about it, so it's nice to actually be on it.
Yeah. You always crack me up.
I'm pretending like
do you want to do any news tonight? We didn't even talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Why not? I mean, that's what the people expect, and we better deliver.
That's true. Yeah. So before we get into that, we're just going to this is just going to be like a conversation. So you are welcome to pose some questions. We did have some people this week send us some questions that they want us to, topics that they want us to touch on. But anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there. If you want to call in, you can also do that later on, not for the first hour or so, and that's 603-967-4030. So what do we got going on for news this week, Alejandro?
Well, we have a big Roswell story, surprise, surprise. But maybe I'll save that for the end because we could talk about that more, take more time with that one. Sure. But some of the other stories that we've gotten lately, this one is kind of a weird one. This witness says he saw a triangle UFO in California. He was in a town called Davis. It was 1:43 a.m. on October 2nd in 2012. This is an older one, and sometimes people say, why are we going over an older one? And that's because Roger Marsh, the director of communications for MUFON, who writes for us, will go into the archives, looking for videos and pictures that were closed as unknowns, investigated by MUFON field investigators, and then he'll write a story and post it on Open Minds for us. So I think that's a cool service, and, I gotta say, before we started doing this just a few years ago, just a couple of years ago, people who are MUFON members probably remember this. Besides the journal, that was about it. I mean, the website was very stagnant. There wasn't a lot going on there, and that's why Roger and I worked this out because I felt, hey, for one, I'll be able to post, a portion of this on the MUFON website, so at least you'll get some stories going and some content because they had nothing. They would go for months with absolutely nothing new on the website, besides if you went straight into the database. And so it's worked really well for both of us. So like in 2012, for instance, there was this stuff wasn't getting out there. So now we're able to delve into those archives and get some of this stuff out there. So a lot of people most people probably haven't seen like this video and heard about this sighting. So it's kind of interesting. It's been a bit controversial because the guy says he woke up because he heard these sounds of horns and trumpets. He looked outside and he saw what he thought was a triangular craft with these lights around it. He was able to videotape it, and you see these 3 lights and these strobing lights. And he only gets it for a few seconds. There are none of these noises are happening while he was filming. So he just thought it was really weird. He thought it was weird that other people hadn't reported it. And so it was closed as an unknown. Now, looking at the video alone, the lights are stroby, kind of like a plane. And a couple of people have said, hey, that's just a plane. So I did post a video of these strobing lights that you can attach to an airplane if you have one. And you can see how they work. And I think they do look similar. Now, some people have disagreed. So, for instance, the MUFON investigator, he disagreed. He said that the object was 500 feet above his head. That's really close, and that it looked like it was huge and triangular, and it had these sounds that came out of it. So he really feels strongly, and that the dog was visibly scared, this guy said. So the guy who investigated it feels very strongly it was not a conventional aircraft. I still kind of argue, how can you tell it's 500 feet if it's night and it's, just this thing above your head. And when you're just waking up, you're so disoriented. The sounds could have not been related to the craft at all, I think is possible. So I don't know. It's an interesting one. I think people should look at it because there's people going either way. Some people are saying that there's no way that these are strobe lights, that this is definitely, a mysterious triangular craft. So, yeah, I implore people to take a look at this one and see what they think.
Uh-huh.
Have you been able to look at it? Probably not, huh? Because we kind of sprung.
No, unfortunately, I have not seen that one. No.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I will check it out.
It's important for you to look at the site daily.
Yes, sir.
And
sorry about that.
Make sure. Yeah.
I'm on it.
So, yeah, that's that one. Let's see. Otherwise, we do have one from – this is kind of a cool story. I won't go into the details of it. And, again, this is not one that is new either. But this is a story written by Paul Stonehill. And this is exciting because it's about UFOs in China. So he does go over especially one scientist in particular and his thoughts about UFOs. And this is a guy who had a couple of great sightings, one of them in 1977. And so you could read about that. What's interesting is there has also been a couple times he predicted there will be some UFO sightings. And he's been accurate. One time, at least in the 80s, his prediction even made it into the news there in China. So it's a really interesting story, and he has some older stories that go back in time. If people remember, Paul Stonehill is a Russian UFO researcher. He's from Russia. He lives in the United States now. He wrote a book about Russia's UFO files, and more recently, however, he's written a book about USOs, so underwater unidentified submersible objects, USOs.
Right. And he was on your show recently. Great interview.
He was. Thank you. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. He's really interesting. So he kind of talks about how it relates these Chinese stories with and how they kind of found out about him through his research in Russian ufology. So, yeah, that's really interesting. Otherwise, another sighting. This one was in Wasilla, Alaska, and this was from another one from 2012, so another one from the archives. But this is another video of kind of like one I think we talked about last week, with these two lights kind of floating through the sky. These lights kind of flew up. But it's kind of a funny video because this lady said she saw these lights and she didn't know what they were, and she got scared. She watched them until she couldn't see them anymore. She knows it was a UFO sighting, and she recorded them and posted those. But it was kind of funny because this happened on October 27th when she was loading her kids into the car to take them to a haunted house. And you can see in the video she's videotaping, and it's kind of like you get the sense that her husband's like, okay, honey, let's go. Let's go. You know, like, could you get done taping your UFOs so we can go now? But so it's kind of an interesting video. That one, again, was investigated and closed as an unknown.
Hey, before we move on to, I know we're going to end the news with Roswell and go into that a little bit. Yeah. But before that, I wanted to talk about China. I used to be in touch with someone over there. We kind of lost touch. He used to actually report in on what's going on in China, but we really don't get a lot of information about UFOs in China. What do you know about that?
Yeah, we don't get a lot of information. I love talking about Chinese ufology, so here we go. And I'm glad you brought this up. But you're right. I think it's the same reason we don't hear a lot except for from Stonehill from Russia. I think non-English speaking countries we just typically don't hear much from. Now, we do hear from Mexico occasionally. Of course, they're close. We have people like Jaime Maussan, bless his heart, you know, who is reporting some stuff, not the best source of information necessarily, less discriminating. So in other words, if Jaime is reporting it, still look into it and take it with a grain of salt. But we also have, of course, in South America, actual government reporting agencies. So we hear from them often. Of course, France has a organization as well. But again, I think because they're not as high profile and because there's a language barrier there, we just don't hear from them. So we just don't hear much about ufology in China. For those reasons, we've interviewed, and you can find it on YouTube, Professor Sun-Shi Lee, who is a Chinese ufologist, and he's a really interesting guy. But, of course, this is what's funny about that interview. Sun-Shi Lee speaks Chinese and Spanish. So he was interviewed by Antonio Huneeus, who used to work for Open Minds, and he speaks many languages, including Spanish. So he had to translate, this Chinese guy speaking Spanish to Antonio, who then translated that to English, which is kind of funny. So I think it's just like, the language barrier is the big issue. But China has an interesting history. One of the best books available that you're just not going to get, so I apologize. But it's written by a guy named Paul Dong in China. And here's what's interesting about China is that we've written quite a bit about this in our magazine and on the website. And I don't see this anywhere else. A lot of this is research that was done by Wendell and Antonio. But in China, they were and Sun-Shi Lee, who has written stories for us and we translated. But essentially, there were Professor Sun-Shi Lee and some of his colleagues were really into UFOs. But at the beginning of China's, socialist or communist regime, they were really tied closely with Russia. And Russia had a bad outlook on the whole UFO topic. So it was really underground and it wasn't really done. So, for instance, the professors in China couldn't really talk about UFOs, and that was because Russia was really in control of things. In the 70s, that began to change, and the Chinese started to take control of themselves. At one point, and I believe it was Sun-Shi Lee, he went to he decided he wanted to start writing about some of these UFO stories and to create an organization, a UFO organization, amongst his colleagues, academics. His wife, I believe it was, worked for, and I'm pretty sure this is all accurate, all the details, but this is essentially how it worked. His wife worked for the government, so they actually approached the government and said, we would like permission to create a UFO journal. And they said, okay, no problem. And they even said, well, who's going to fund it? And Sushi's like, I don't know. I haven't gotten that far. The Chinese government actually offered to fund this journal. And so the journal got created, and that started this organization that burgeoned into a huge organization with a lot of members. And it's more like a professional scientific society where if you're a doctor or a professional, you can join the society as a full-fledged member. But if you're not a doctor, then you can only be kind of an associate member, and you can get the journal and stuff like that. So kind of like we were talking about with MUFON, they would put out a journal that was written on a monthly basis. But moving forward in time to this book, so when did that information start getting here? Wendell Stevens, some of you may know, he's an American in the Air Force, very controversial. He worked with Billy Myers and some other contactees, quote unquote, some of the cases that aren't that credible. Essentially what happened is Paul Dong wrote this book about UFOs in China, and these are cases that were from, the like early 1900s up until that time period in the 80s. Really great cases. He asked Wendell if Wendell would like to get that translated and print it in English. And Wendell said, well, I'd love to, but I don't speak Chinese. Paul Dong actually went to the government. The government offered to translate it, and one of the departments in the Chinese government translated his book into English, gave that text to Wendell with all of these wonderful pictures and everything, and Wendell printed that and packaged it, and it's just a book full of great, incredible Chinese cases. Luckily for you all, in our magazine, Open Minds Magazine, but also on our website, we have a lot of these stories that you'll be able to find here and there. And in fact, at least one of these stories that is in the Paul Stonehill story was also in Wendell's book. So at least one of the images, maybe a couple, come from the book that Wendell Stevens worked on. But if you can get it, there's good sites out there, Abe's books and others. Look for, UFOs over China and written by Wendell Stevens, and you'll be able to see it.
You had one more. When we chatted earlier today, I'd like to talk about what the article that you're working on, if you would.
Roswell. So some people get upset, and they're like, oh, man, why are they talking about Roswell again? I get so tired of hearing about Roswell. Do you get that? Have you heard people complain about that?
Always, yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and so to those people, I would say, regardless of what you may think, and you can call in and we can debate this, but there are not a lot of great cases out there with an abundance of credible witnesses. Roswell is one of those very, very, very few cases, and that's why Roswell is important. And not only that, when the general public thinks UFOs, they think Roswell. So that also makes it really important. But this also makes it really important. This story is cool. So Kevin Randall, some of you, have you had him on the show?
Oh, yes, a few times, yep.
Yeah, so he's great. He's a Roswell researcher. He's a UFO researcher and author. He's got a blog out there. And in his blog, just late last week, he wrote that one of his colleagues, someone he's been in communication with, has offered to I guess they were talking about this Ramey memo, which I'll get to, but they've offered to pay $10,000 to anyone who can decipher this memo. So let's explain this memo. So what happened, it just to give people a little refresher, is in 1947, in particular on July 8th was the day that we're looking at. This was the morning when Walter Haut, who was the communications guy at the Roswell Army Airfield, sent out the press release that said, "We found a flying saucer." And of course, he based that off of the intelligence officer for the Roswell Army Air Force Air Base intelligence officer Jesse Marcel, who went the day before to look at this debris that people had, that Mac Brazel said was a crashed UFO. He went and looked at debris. He couldn't figure out what it was. He brought it in. And then on the 8th, he was ordered to take this material and have it shipped to Fort Worth, and for himself also to go to Fort Worth, where he would meet General Roger Ramey. So while he's in the air and while he's there, Walter Haut writes this press release, sends it out in the morning of the 8th. The AP then in the afternoon of the 8th posts the story, the Air Force or the Army Air Force, because at the time, that was about the time right before the Air Force was created. So it was a department of the Army, actually. Wrote the big story, and so it went everywhere that they found this flying saucer. Well, Ramey, when Jesse Marcel got to Fort Worth, they walked Jesse Marcel to Ramey's office, and in his office, he had some material on the floor that later Marcel said was obviously a weather balloon. But he was told, we're going to tell the public that this is what you found. And being a good soldier, Jesse Marcel Jr., who was a friend of mine, confirmed this. As a good soldier, Jesse Marcel said, "Yes, sir." Didn't ask questions. These were his orders. He said, "We'll tell people this is what I got." So a photographer came in. They took pictures of Ramey, his chief of staff, Colonel Thomas DuBois, and Jesse Marcel with this material that was obviously a weather balloon. Then they sent out a reply that, "Oh, sorry, we screwed up. That wasn't a flying saucer. It was a weather balloon." So in these pictures, Roger Ramey is holding a piece of paper. And in most of these pictures, you can't tell what is on that piece of paper. But in one of these pictures, it looks like there's some writing on it or something. What some researchers have done, the most well-known who's done this is David Rudiak.
Right.
And in fact, in my story, I have a video of a part of a Sci-Fi Channel special where they go over Rudiak and his findings. But they've taken, good, clear photos, and they've been able to scan them and blow them up. And David Rudiak has looked at this memo, and he feels that you can see some things on this memo, such as the phrases "and the victims of the wreck," and another phrase, "in the disk they will ship." He thinks that's very important because it indicates to him that there was a disc that was found. When it says "victims of the wreck," he feels that then that corroborates the testimony from some of the witnesses who say there were, aliens that were found that were part of this crash. So he actually has ideas about what the entire memo said. In fact, I could read it if you want me to.
Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It says FWAAF, Fort Worth Army Airfield is what that stands for, acknowledges that a disc is the next new find west of the cordon. At location or in addition was a wreck, or perhaps he thinks it might say pod or airfoil, near operation at the ranch, and the victims of the wreck you forwarded to the team at Fort Worth, Texas. Aviators in the disc, they will ship for A8 Army Airfield. That part he's less clear about. By B-29 or C-47, Wright Air Force assesses airfoil at Roswell about that or about noon. Some of these words he has alternate possibilities. Said that this misstate meaning of story and think late today next sent out PR of weather balloon would take if photos used in land something cruise. So, I mean, as you can tell, he's definitely not got it all figured out.
But you know, that's a lot more than I heard before that was deciphered on this. Mm-hmm. So is this recently?
Well, this is his, not really. I mean, this is as of, this is what he feels that the memo most likely says. He's uncertain about all of this. He's most certain about, like, those two phrases. But, yeah, that's what he feels most likely what it says.
That's pretty amazing.
So the thing is that not everybody agrees with him. Some people have accused him of being biased, and so that has, tainted his deciphering of this letter. Kevin Randall has been a bit critical of some of the areas of the letter. In fact, and this is interesting, the Air Force themselves took a look at this picture and tried to decipher what was in the letter. So in 1994, New Mexico Congressman Stephen Schiff asked the Air Force to explain what's going on in Roswell. Why are people talking about this? And I should explain to people, some people probably don't realize this, but that Roswell was really unknown until the 80s. That once Ramey came out and said, oops, sorry, it was a weather balloon, the public and the press said, oh, okay, it was just a weather balloon, and it was lost to obscurity. Until there are a couple obscure references here and there to it, but that's about it. But then it was about 79, it was the late 70s when Stan Friedman heard about Jesse Marcel telling people about this, and so he interviewed Jesse Marcel, and Jesse Marcel said, yeah, that was not a weather balloon. That was an alien spacecraft. And so Stanton, along with Bill Moore, they began researching and finding other witnesses, and that culminated into Bill Moore's book about Roswell. And then Stanton wrote a book, and all kinds of books came out. And that's when it got huge. Then everybody started to know about Roswell. And so Roswell got so big that this congressman asked, what's going on here? Everybody's talking about Roswell. What is this? And so in 1994, and it was updated in 95, the Air Force wrote this long paper, something like 300 pages, about what they thought Roswell was. Really, I feel it's not that great of a investigation. They didn't talk to a lot of the important witnesses. They didn't talk to Marcel, just used some of the things he said. One of the other things that's important is Dubois, who's in the picture with Ramey. Mm-hmm. I've posted this video on our story, but he has said it was a cover-up. He said that weather balloon was not what was there. It was understood by all of us in that room that was a cover-up. Now, the Air Force, in their analysis, said that it was a cover-up, that Ramey and for some reason had decided to cover up what it really was and call it a weather balloon when it was in reality a Project Mogul balloon. It seems like they even question, though, whether Ramey would have even known about Project Mogul, but they say it was a Project Mogul balloon, and so Ramey didn't want the public to know about Project Mogul, so he said it was a weather balloon. Project Mogul was still a balloon. This was balloons they were launching that had listening devices on them, so they could listen for Russian detonations of nuclear bombs, so they can see if there were testing. So that's why they said the cover-up happened. But again, Jesse Marcel says that was not a balloon. I mean, I would have known what a mogul looked like. I would have known what balloons looked like. This was not a balloon, according to Jesse Marcel and other witnesses. Mm-hmm. So, and then you have this memo. So people still feel that this memo could be like the smoking gun to Roswell, that if we can figure out definitively, what's on that memo, then we can figure out what's going on with Roswell. And that's essentially, I guess, what Randall says he was talking with his friend about is, if we could fund a lab to do some real research, because, hire some professionals to figure out what's in that would be really cool. And that's when his colleague decided, well, I'll offer a $10,000 reward. So he does say that in order to get the reward, there must be overwhelming agreement that the result is definitive with the most of the text clear enough that there is little or no disagreement on what it says across a broad spectrum of people of all opinions, whether true believer or complete skeptic.
Now is this the original scan or the original negative? Is that what Rudiak is working off of?
No, I mean, but he has scans of that negative.
Uh-huh.
And as far as I know, that's the best source if you go to Rudiak's website for the best versions of those images. And I'm sure on one of his blog, Kevin Randall has links to that as well. But I have a link to Rudiak's site here.
Well,
some people have complained, how can there be a consensus amongst people? There's never a consensus amongst
Good point.
people. So that's impossible. But Randall then argued that, well, remember the Roswell slide? That when that placard was deciphered, with the Roswell slide, of course, was when these people found this photo. They were saying it was an alien, but there's a placard in it. But that placard was quickly deciphered by some people on the internet, some great researchers, and they even showed me how to do it so I could do it myself. And we all came to the consensus that, yes, the placard said, this was a mummified body of a Native American, essentially a museum display. So he argued that, there was a consensus about what that placard said, and that the only ones who didn't agree with the deciphering of the placard were the people that had a vested interest in the photo being an alien. People like Jaime Maussan, who never gave up that it's an alien when it obviously is not. So so I think that indicates that, if Randall is involved with being able to make the judgment that as long as what he determines are sober, credible researchers who have come to a consensus, then hopefully they'll award this money. But and I trust Kevin Randall. I think Kevin Randall is one of the best researchers out there. I think he's great, very grounded, very level-headed. He's never given anyone reason, I don't think, to doubt his credibility at all. Which you can't say for every researcher out there. But so that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Now, it makes me, one of the first things I think of is, who would you go to that would have the best equipment to decipher this? And the first thing I think of is the FBI or some CIA or something like that would have the best equipment for actually deciphering this. First of all, it was a boo-boo for him to be holding that in his hand, obviously. And second of all, though, if that is so that the FBI or CIA or whoever could decipher it, would they even bother? I mean, is it even an issue that they would ever think about? And another thing is... about the crash itself, and you mentioned Kevin Randall just a second ago, and last time I had him on the show, I said, I told him what the skeptics often say about Roswell, that it hadn't been heard of, for years, and it just popped up in 1980 when Stan Friedman got a hold of it, and he said, well, on the contrary, when it first happened, it was like the biggest story of July of 1947. It probably was, but it was one of those flash in the pans. As soon as the press release went out to recant it and calling it a weather balloon, it did die, like you said. Totally died until it was brought up again. And I think I heard that somewhere in Canada there was some type of publication, like in the 1960s or something about it. But other than that, it was very little talked about, which is kind of unusual, I think, in general, because it was such a major broadcast of this thing being found. I mean, when in time has it ever happened that the Air Force said they had a disc? I mean, it's just kind of weird that it just went away so like it did.
You know what? And you make another great point, and why Roswell's important. I mean, never have we had the Air Force say we found a UFO except for, or a flying saucer, which at that time, implied an extraterrestrial spacecraft. I mean, if you listen, and Rudiak has it on his website, but if you listen to those radio broadcasts, they make a comment, something like, we finally know, we're finally going to figure out what are these flying saucers that have been seen flying all over the country. So it was something that people were aware of, that was going on. It was a news story. And the Air Force says, they've captured one. We've never had that. So that's what makes this a big deal. And I think, makes all of this a big deal. So as far as who would do it, I think you've got a great point. I think that doing it this way, you would have to have someone who's willing to go to some lab. I'm sure there are some labs that do this sort of thing. Data recovery type specialists that work also on deciphering material like this. But someone would have to want to put the money up front with the expectation that they'll be able to get it at the end. Or a lab that does this kind of work would need to be confident enough that they'd be able to decipher it, that they would be like, hey, let's do this and make some money. So, yeah, but, in a situation like that, $10,000 is nothing if you went to hire like a real specialized lab to decipher. They'd probably want a retainer of $10,000, to start. Do you think so?
Yeah, probably. I
have no idea what something like this would cost. That seems high, but maybe you're right. I don't know.
No, I actually contacted a place in Illinois about. We had a conversation, and it's still not completely over yet, about the MJ-12 papers that were found in a CIA's estate. This is something I brought up a while back, and so I contacted this company, and just to do testing to see if the paper was from 1947 and the ink. They wanted a $2,500 retainer. So I can imagine if someone is going to try to decipher a letter like that, it's going to be big bucks. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm totally wrong. But before we move off of the subject, I want to stay on it for a little bit. Also, just to let you know, I had an email today from a listener that randomly said, he was a mailman, and he delivered mail to this guy and had conversations, an ex-NSA agent. And one day, not to elaborate any more than what he said, the mailman said that Roswell did indeed happen with aliens and everything, crash and aliens. Whether, I don't know if I'll get any more information and if anything can be, if anything can be elaborated on, and if this guy is who he says he is and all that stuff. But I thought that was pretty interesting. It just happened today.
Yeah, that is interesting. So, so we'll see what happens with this. Hopefully people pick it up, and hopefully it reinvigorates kind of this search for what the letter might have said. When you were mentioning the FBI getting involved or someone going to the FBI, maybe this is their opportunity to say, you know what, we decided to take another look and, come up with a version, something like maybe make it seem like he was being yelled at, like, what kind of mess are we in? You guys have made us the victims of the wreck of this disaster of the press release. We're going to stick this disc where the sun won't shine or something like that, to kind of make it seem like it was something other than what it really may have been. But who knows? I think it's really interesting what they think they see so far.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's something that, people talk about quite often. So
yeah, well, Roswell it has a lot of moving parts. It's one of those things that obviously is never going to die. But I wonder sometimes, what will Roswell be 100 years from now if we never actually get the evidence that something indeed really did happen? If we never get the full-on evidence, because so much of it is turned into mythology. And you go to Roswell every year. Matter of fact, you're doing a talk there. You can mention a little bit about that coming up in a few weeks. You're going to be out there. And so you know what I'm talking about. Like, there's a lot of this that just gets into pop culture and gets distorted, which makes me wonder what the Roswell future is.
Yeah, what's interesting is Roswell is definitely kind of it's interesting to see, for instance, when people come to, and it's kind of like how our field is in general, when people come to Roswell, they have ideas about UFOs and Roswell, even though many of them haven't read a book. Maybe they've seen movies, maybe a couple episodes of a documentary, and that's about it. But people just kind of get these ideas. It represents how they feel about the possibility or likelihood that we're being visited by ET right now. And that makes it kind of interesting. And it's interesting that, some people would, when they see, just hear very lightly that supposedly this UFO crashed and there were aliens in it. Oh, yeah, that happened. And just right immediately they can believe it and think that it probably happened, whereas others are immediately skeptical. And others, I like for me, it makes me want to look more into it, really. Who says this? Why do people believe this? So, I mean, you get to see how belief systems work and how different people operate, which I think is really important, because really when it comes to worldviews or the elections and all of the talk that's going on right now is a great example. The direction a society moves in is based off of beliefs and concepts and ideas that don't necessarily need to be rooted in any evidence reality, but just a belief, A lot of countries are governed by their religions, and that pushes them forward, or that motivates their decision making. For us, there's debates about climate change. There's debates about everything. There's conspiracies about Trump and Hillary and Obama. There's conspiracies about everybody, about, some ominous things they may or may not have been related to that help people decide why they do what they do. So these kind of things, these belief systems are important when it comes to what's going to happen in the future. So what people think of Roswell in the future, I think, will be important as to especially what people think of this field, or, how much they may divert from belief in science and or governments. I think one of the things that we've seen, and especially I feel, and others may disagree, and I don't mean this to mean that it's all the Republicans, but certainly during the Bush era and during when defense lost all that money, and Rumsfeld was having to answer for these millions and billions of dollars that the defense couldn't account for. During that period of time, it seems like people began to really just be skeptical of the government and everything that they have to say. And that has not been repaired. And I think, for us working in this field, just like Ramey lying about the weather balloon, we've all kind of opened our eyes and come to this realization that the government isn't necessarily going to tell the truth. Neither are companies. That there's a knee-jerk reaction to lie or to keep secrets. And so that leaves us, I think, disillusioned and sort of and skeptical. And so that can be damaging. Jacques Vallée used to talk a lot about this sort of idea. And so when you take climate change, for instance, when scientists are saying one thing, or the EPA or NASA is saying one thing, and people are deciding not to believe that in mass, it shows then how much of an influence those traditional influencers have had and how that's waning. And then so what becomes the influencers out there? Who knows? Maybe you'll have someone like Stephen Bassett running on a ET platform and using things like the MJ12 files, which I think are highly dubious and not real whatsoever, in my own opinion or research, or let's say something else, some other mythology that is created. Maybe the Roswell slides, for instance, that becomes where everybody starts believing that really was an alien. I mean, what I'm getting at is that the masses in their beliefs can wane and ebb and flow, and it doesn't necessarily have to be based off of science or anything. So who knows? Roswell could burgeon into something huge, or it could be further debunked and be something that's seen as more of a joke. But at least right now, I think the trend is for people to take this sort of stuff more seriously.
Well, I wonder also if there's any other Roswells out there. In other words, something that happened somewhere along the line and was covered up quickly, and we just haven't found out. I wonder if, it's possible that someday another Roswell will land on the UFO doorstep, that, something happened and was quickly changed. I don't, because here I consider Roswell, most skeptics and people that really pay attention to this topic, that it's probably the most important case, at least in American history, as far as UFOs go, and it was unknown for all those years. Excuse me. What else could be unknown out there?
Yeah. It's possible. It could be something that's uncovered, via something like WikiLeaks. For example, there are UFO files in there, not a whole lot, but George Knapp, even today, posted on Facebook a WikiLeaks of a Algerian UFO sighting. That's something. WikiLeaks didn't just post that. This file was posted something like 3 years ago, but it's just something that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, and it's short. It doesn't say a whole lot. Some people have reported a sighting, but it's an interesting sighting. So if, a WikiLeaks file reports something that opens up a Pandora's box.
Oops. You back?
It says it says you put me on hold.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was trying to take a call and I pushed the wrong button. And
upset you.
So, caller, if sorry I hung up on you, if you want to try again, I'll try to click the right button this time. So along those lines, we had a question come in by email this week that asks, what if anything, did Gary McKinnon see? Now, Gary McKinnon was a hacker that broke into, was it NSA? Do you remember who he?
We've got a story on it, and I think it's one of the best stories. He broke into, I know, a JPL. I would have to look. I can't remember all of the ones. I'll look it up. Eventually, he broke into a couple places. And one of them, and these were like NASA and stuff like that. Now, these are claims, what he claims to have seen or hacked into. And one of the hard parts is, and people get mad at me for saying this, but if you look at my story, I reference Gary McKinnon's comments himself, because I essentially wanted to figure this out too. What did he actually say that he saw? Because I didn't think there was a good story out there for that. So I did a lot of research to find out from his own mouth, not just what other people were saying, what he said. And essentially he says he was drunk and stoned the entire time he was doing this, hacking in. And it wasn't like he was this major mastermind hacker. He was able to build this software that would go in and look for computers that essentially hadn't set their password and username. So it was looking for like the username, and password of password. It was looking for computers where people hadn't set their usernames. And it was at a level to where, these are computers that were accessible that weren't in the deep firewalls and stuff. So the computer systems belong to NASA, the Army, the Navy, the Department of Defense, and the Air Force. What he says he found a satellite picture of a UFO, and that this was the time period of dial-up. And that he was looking at it, but before he could download it, he was busted and they turned him off. So that should have indicated to him, hey, they know you're looking, but he kept looking anyway. Here's his exact quote too. He said, I was smoking a lot of dope at the time, not good for the intellect. The other thing that he said he saw is he broke into U.S. Space Command, and he said he saw a roster of non-terrestrial officers. And to him, that makes him believe that perhaps there's a space program out there that is going on, and that's why these guys were called non-terrestrial officers. Space Command hasn't said we do have non-terrestrial officers. Nobody's kind of said what that means or if he even saw that. There are rumors that he saw the transfer logs of the names of ships that are like spaceships. The USSS for like United States Spaceship LeMay and the USSS Hillenkotter. And these are names of people who allegedly have been related to UFO issues. However, that is just a rumor. That is not something that Gary McKinnon said himself. So essentially, that's about it. He was inspired by Stephen Greer and the Disclosure Project, which is kind of funny because so was I. But to get into all of this, the Disclosure Project itself. But that's about it. So there's not much that he said, and he doesn't remember much, and he didn't download anything because he was drunk and stoned the whole time he was doing it. And these are his words. So you can go to the story. It's called "What Did UFO Hacker Really Find?" I've got a story on this. And I've got links to all of my references to his interviews where he's talked about what he actually saw. The sad thing is it was kind of funny because when they busted him, they came to his house and they took him away, and they offered him a really good deal that could have saved him a lot of headache. They offered him something like 6 months probation or something if he just admits to it and stuff. And he thought he would be cool. And he said, no, I don't think you're going to bust me because I've got information you don't want out there. And they were like, oh, yeah, what information? And, of course, all he had was this. And so they said no and threw the book at him. And we're going to extradite him and throw him in jail for like 20 years or something like that. He won his case where he didn't get extradited. However, they weren't afraid whatsoever of the this information that he thought they would be afraid to get out.
Wow. So that's the side of the story I've never heard.
Yeah.
And so that just goes to show that how things can get distorted.
Yeah, they're really distorted out there because now, especially about these, in some circles out there, it's like a given that the USS Ramey and the USS Hillenkotter are flying around out there, and they're these giant spaceships with these non-terrestrial officers and military personnel on there and everything, but no, those were rumors. I think I know where those rumors stem from, and the person who said them and made that rumor popular, I asked him, where did you hear that? And he said, I don't know, I think I heard that somewhere. And it's unfortunate because then this person goes out there and talks about it, and these people believe what this person has to say. And I won't say his name because I don't want to trash him or anything, but yeah, this person is just an older person who his memory is a bit faulty, and he goes out there and talks and shows a bunch of pictures and says they're from places where they're not. This is someone who's old enough where they never got on the internet, so they don't know that, on the internet you can find the real places these come from. But unfortunately, a lot of people take people at their words and don't do the research and believe everything that they have to say. And
now, can you say his first name like in a cough? Like
no.
This guy? No. Okay. Well,
no. I'm going to give you absolutely no hint as to who this person is.
I'm going to try to. This guy that's been trying to call us. I'm going to try to dial out. So have patience. I hope this isn't one of these things that crashes. I'm going to try to dial him. So, Phil, I'm going to try to dial you. Here we go. I'm going to try to add you. I have no idea what's going to happen when I press the send button. Could be goodbye to Alejandro. We'll see. Now, how do you do it? Nothing's happening. Well, I just did it on add, trying to add the call, and okay, I guess we're not going to be able to waste any of the time. Whoops, that didn't do anything. All right. Sorry about that, Phil. We tried. Okay, so I'm going to ask you let's see. He wanted to know, this is in the message board, he wanted to talk about the Frank Edwards book and the UFO thing that happened in his hometown, which is Michigan, I believe. Do you know anything about that?
No. However, the Frank Edwards book is a lot of very dubious information. So I think he's talking about, if I'm thinking about the right book, it's like one of the very first UFO books.
An early one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Or no, maybe I'm not thinking of the same one. I'm not sure. No, I can't think of what that is anyway, so I apologize. Not familiar.
So there's so many different directions we can take this this show in, and we're right at the top of the hour. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the different kind of groups that sort of do not collaborate. We don't really have to get into that right away. So that's it for the first part of the show, the free part. If you want to support the show and listen to all the 2-hour shows, and that includes the archives, of course, all you have to do is support us for $2 or more a month. You can find that information on podcastufo.com on the top menu bar. Support the show. So thanks so much for listening. And if you can't support the show, we still appreciate you listening to this part and hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back next week. I want to thank Alejandro for being the guest on the show this evening. Also, Peggy for running the Facebook page. Carrie Lloyd Whitehouse for the music. We'll be back next week. Thanks again, and keep your eyes to the sky.